Welcome to a study of the Sermon on the Mount. I've been asked to put together some Bible class lessons for you since right now with the current coronavirus pandemic that we're going through, many of us are kind of locked down and not able to get out and definitely not able to meet for worship and Bible class. So hopefully this can give you some good information. I want this to be something very practical and beneficial to you. So hopefully you've been able to find this not only on the web, but you should find a link nearby to where you're watching this so that you can download some notes that'll be helpful. It'll have some discussion questions and some things that you can do that are a little bit more interactive, some exercises for you to do on your own. So I want this to be fun and not just a bunch of listening to Daryl talk kind of thing, but something real and practical for you. Sermon on the Mount is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. There's also a version of that in Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 49. It's missing some of the same teachings. It's a lot shorter in Luke, and sometimes the Luke version is called a Sermon on the Plain because Luke talks about Jesus teaching this Sermon on the Plain, whereas Matthew starts it off talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Most scholars do believe that this sermon, as it's sometimes referred to and very often referred to, is actually a compilation of teachings of Jesus, and that Matthew and Luke put these together because they are so powerful, that they are so pointed. Both Matthew and Luke record these at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and both are addressed primarily to his disciples, and so it tends to be a teaching that is for those who profess to be followers of Jesus. It has been a text that has been challenging Christians almost since the very time that it was spoken. You can go back to 350 AD when John Chrysanthemum starts. You can read some commentaries of him and some of the ancient things. But I really hope that first and foremost you'll spend some time reading the Sermon on the Mount. Open your Bibles, look at the Sermon on the Mount. One of the handy things that I found to do is take note of some of the little subtitles. What are some of the things that the text is talking about? Notice some of the topics that he's addressing in this, because I think you'll begin to see and get a bigger picture of what is being addressed in this text. And so I'm really going to pause the video now, and I want to encourage you, take a minute, open up your Bibles together with whoever you're at, or whoever, if you're by yourself, read Matthew 5, 6, and 7. If possible, read it out loud. Remember, these were teachings of Jesus. These weren't just some things written on a page in a book. These were meant to be heard. And I think we miss out some of that benefit when we don't make that connection between our ears and our eyes and our mouths. And when we can verbalize them and hear them, it really enforces it. So it'll take you about 10-15 minutes, but read through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Pause the video, and then come back and we'll continue on. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your reading of the sermon, of Jesus' teachings there. Want to give you about 4 different things real quickly as we jump into the text so that we can talk about this and you can get a bigger picture. One of the things that to me, and I hope you caught, that jumps out is that this sermon tends to be an extended view of the law. Jesus looks at the Old Testament often, but he gives it a richer and deeper view, and trying to fulfill the law and add deeper meaning to what's going on. You've heard it said, but now I tell you. And he'll take the Old Testament and he'll make it deeper. Notice that as you read through the Sermon on the Mount. It's something very powerful and very, very amazing that Jesus does in there. A second thing that you'll see that Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount is the topics tend to be a lot about practical Christian living. You start looking about the things that he talks about, and he's talking about facets of our life. He's talking about our attitude. He's talking about our actions. He's talking about our faith. And so as you look through that, take note. This is tended to be very, very practical. It's not just some high theoretical thing that we're talking about for real. The third thing about it is notice the ethics that are involved. Ethics have to do with what drive our behavior, what's behind what we do. And Jesus really is addressing that. He's wanting us to look at why do we do what we do, and how can we achieve, and how can we become even deeper and more meaningful than that. The fourth thing, before we jump into some text in the Bible, is notice the commands. There are numerous commands throughout the text, and the text speaks with authority. At the very end, as we're going to see in just a second, you'll see how the people were amazed at the authority because Jesus seems to expect us to do something with this. It's not just something to listen to, it's not just something to read, but it's something for us to do. So turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. I want us to start at the end of this text. I want us to start here because Jesus seems to, well, I think if we look at the end, and with the end in mind, we can gain the beginning of it. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 29. It should be up on your screen if I'm doing this right, and you can read along with me. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And anyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching as one who had authority and not as the scribes. Notice in this text, there's a couple of things I want you to catch, some key points here. Jesus expects us to live the Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't just tell us these things. He's saying, be like a wise man, not a foolish man. And one of the hardest things about this sermon is there's some very challenging things in here. And if you're like me, as I'm reading through this text going, man, there's some hard stuff for me to do. How am I going to do all this? And we can adopt a mentality, well, that's not possible to achieve. And there have been some great theologians that have approached this and said, no, it's impossible to do. This is just a level that we're supposed to try for. But yet at the same time, he ends this by saying, you want to be a wise man? Live by these things. Do these things. The Sermon on the Mount was intended for us to live by them. There's a neat quote that Randy Harris, and really recommend this book if you can see it here. Randy Harris, in his book Living Jesus, he says some things in it that, and I borrowed heavily from him in our Sunday morning Bible class. We're watching some of the videos that go with it. So if you don't have this book, it's really a good book. Randy Harris, Living Jesus, excuse me. He brings out something in here that I think is really worth mentioning here, and I want you to catch what he says on here as he gets into this, because Randy says on here, he says the Sermon on the Mount is the most practical, realistic way to live the Christian life that you can imagine. Jesus actually expects us to do this stuff. He thinks you can live out your life in this sort of way. Now, it's up to you as you read. Will you? And that really becomes the question that we need to ask ourselves as we begin this study. Will you do what Jesus says? The second point that I want you to catch on this. When we live these teachings, our lives will be stronger, they'll be more stable, and they'll be able to withstand the storms. This verse we just read, many of us grew up singing the song, the wise man built his house upon the rock, the wise man, and we know the song. But what happens when the rains come a-tumbling down? Well, if you're the wise man and you've built your house on the rock, what's going to happen? It stands firm. Whereas what happens when the house that's built on the sand that hasn't practiced these teachings? Smash. We see it going down. We know that. Jesus is teaching a parable through this. Okay, so when life gets difficult, what are we building our lives on? I sit here in my office away from the world, trying to wash my hands incessantly and keep away from viruses. Our world is going crazy. There's a storm brewing outside. And we need to build as a foundation for our lives these teachings. Because when I live like this, when I really adapt this attitude and this heart that Jesus is, I really do take on the Sermon on the Mount like Jesus says, I really can live like him. Challenge for you this week. Spend some time reading the Sermon on the Mount. Read through it in different translation. Read through it in as many times as you can. Make notes as you go. What is God speaking to you? What's he telling you to do? How can I live like Jesus this week? Come back for the next lesson and we'll go even deeper. We're going to jump in back to the beginning next time though. Thank you for joining me. Hopefully I'll see you again. God bless.